The soil of the northern forests does not remember the names of the weak. It only remembers the weight of the iron that crushed them. In the year 862, a shadow fell across the lands of the East Slavs, the Finns, and the Kriviches, a shadow that no amount of fire could dispel. This was not a moment of quiet transition, it was a moment of absolute, bone-chilling crisis. The tribe stood on the precipice of total extinction, facing a choice that would echo through 1,000 years of history. They needed a master, or they would face the silence of the grave. To understand the birth of the Rus, one must first understand the smell of ash and the sound of a society tearing itself apart from the inside out. This is the dark thriller of a people who reached into the abyss and asked for a chain to hold them together. The stories whispered in the freezing winds of the Baltic tell of a cycle of chaos that could not be broken by those living within it. For years, these tribes had lived under the shadow of the Varangians, seafaring warriors from the north who moved like ghosts through the intricate river systems. These northerners were not merely traders, they were collectors of life and silver. The tribes paid tribute in heavy furs and precious metals, a steep price for a fragile, humiliating peace. But the human spirit can only endure so much subservience. In a sudden, desperate burst of defiance, the tribes rose up. They drove the northerners back across the Grey Sea, reclaiming their forests and their rivers. They sought to govern themselves, to breathe the air of a freedom they believed was their birthright. But that freedom quickly turned into a poisoned chalice, proving that the absence of a tyrant is not the same thing as the presence of peace. Without a common enemy to fear, the tribes found enemies in each other. The Great Discord began not with an invasion, but with a spark of internal jealousy. Smoke did not rise from foreign torches, but from the hearts of neighbors. Imagine a world where every sunrise brings the threat of a brother's blade. Bloodlines that had coexisted for generations were severed in a single night of lawless fury. In the dense thickets of the north, there was no law, only the jagged edge of a steel blade. The land wept for a stability that seemed lost forever. The way from the Varangians to the Greeks, the vital artery of trade that connected the cold north to the golden domes of Byzantium, was no longer a trade route, it was a graveyard. The very concept of order dissolved into a desperate vacuum where the strongest survived only until someone more desperate took what they had. In the heart of this gathering darkness, a council was called. Picture the leaders of the Chud, the Slavs, the Kriviches, and the Veps gathered in a clearing where the ancient trees felt like watching sentinels. They looked at their scarred hands and realized that their own strength had become their undoing. The silence in that clearing must have been suffocating, broken only by the crackle of a dying fire. They reached a conclusion that defies modern logic, a decision born of pure, cold necessity. They decided to look beyond their borders, back toward the very men they had once cast out. They sought a ruler who had no stake in their ancient blood feuds, someone whose authority would be absolute because it was foreign. It was a gamble of the highest order, to trade their blood-soaked independence for a cold, foreign peace. The messengers sent across the gray waves of the Baltic carried a message that was simple, haunting, and devastating. They traveled through mist and salt spray, their small boats tossed by the unforgiving sea, seeking the silhouette of the Northmen. The Baltic in autumn is a cruel mistress, a churning expanse of slate-gray water that hides the bones of thousands. These men rowed until their palms bled, driven by the knowledge that they could not go home unless they brought back a master. When they finally found their audience, they stood before warriors whose eyes held the coldness of the icebergs they navigated. They spoke the words that would define the birth of a superpower. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. It was an admission of total failure, a surrender of autonomy in exchange for the chance to survive. These messengers were not seeking a partner, they were seeking a conqueror who could impose a structure they were unable to build themselves. They sought a figure who had emerged from the shadows of history, a man named Rurik. When the horizon finally broke to reveal the silhouette of Longships, the air didn't fill with the sounds of celebration, but with a profound, suffocating tension. These ships, with their high-arched dragon heads and rows of shields along the gunnels, didn't just carry men, they carried a new destiny. The rhythmic splash of the oars was the heartbeat of an approaching empire. Imagine the scene on the muddy banks of the Fokhof River. The tribal elders stood trembling, their breath misting in the cold air, as the prows of the ships bit into the earth. Rurik did not come alone. Beside him stood his brothers, Cineas and Truver, and a host of warriors whose reputation for discipline was as cold as the steel they carried. This was the calling of the Varangians, an invitation that would transform a collection of warring clans into the foundation of a nation. There was no warmth in Rurik's eyes, only the calculation of a man who knew how to bind a broken world. Rurik did not wait for ceremonies or the pleasantries of diplomacy. When his boots first touched the shore of Stylized, the transition began instantly. He was a man who lived by the code of the sea and the sword, stepping into a land that was fractured and deeply suspicious. He established his seat in Lataga, his eyes already turning toward the strategic depths of the interior. He knew that to rule this wild land, he had to pin it down like a struggling beast. There was no room for negotiation in his new world. The old tribal structures, built on kinship and local custom, began to wither almost immediately under the gaze of the Varangian guard. Rurik's presence was a physical weight, a constant reminder that the era of the Great Discord was over, replaced by the era of the Iron Prince. He did not ask for permission, he issued commands that were backed by the glint of Norse steel. His brothers moved with lethal efficiency to secure the perimeter of this new realm, ensuring that the peace was not just signed, but enforced. Cineas marched to the strongholds of Belazero, deep in the frozen north, where the lakes stay frozen half the year and the wind screams through the pines. Truver took command of Izborsk, guarding the western approaches against those who might see the transition as a moment of weakness. Together, they created a triangle of iron that pinned the warring tribes in place. They brought with them a new language of power, one that did not seek consensus, but dictated reality. The chaos began to recede, but it was replaced by something far more formidable, the birth of a centralized state. The rhythmic beat of tribal drums was replaced by the synchronized rhythm of oars and the heavy tread of armored boots. Every movement of the Varangian brothers was a message to the tribes: your internal wars are a luxury you can no longer afford. Rurik did not just bring peace, he brought a cold, calculated system of survival. He introduced a network of fortresses that acted as the nervous system of the land, ensuring that no rebellion could go unnoticed. He established a hierarchy of taxation that fed a growing military machine, turning the wild riches of the forest, the pelts of sable, the wax of the bees, the strength of the young men, into the fuel for an empire. The wild rivers that served as the highways of the north were now guarded by Varangian steel. Every village, every clearing, and every trade post now felt the gaze of the Rurikids. The transition was brutal. It was the end of the old world and the beginning of a new order where the law was consistent, even if it was harsh. To live under Rurik was to be part of a machine, a cog in a grand design that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Yet, beneath the surface of this new order, the old tensions remained like embers under snow. Not everyone welcomed the foreign lords with open arms. In the dark corners of the longhouses, where the firelight flickered against the smoke-stained walls, men whispered that they had traded one form of slavery for another. They watched as the forests were cleared for forts and the rivers were harnessed for trade that benefited the new elite. The mystery of Rurik's true identity continues to haunt the corridors of history even today. Was he a Danish prince named Rurik of Dorstad, a restless soul who had lost his holdings in the west and sought a new empire in the east? Or was he a figure whose story was polished by later chroniclers to justify the absolute reign of his descendants? The truth is buried beneath layers of myth, but his impact remains undeniable. He was the catalyst that turned a collection of victims into a force of history. The shadows of the Rurikid line deepened as they expanded southward, driven by an insatiable ambition for wealth and territory. Rurik understood that Latagat and Novgorod were only the beginning. His trusted men, Askald and Diar, set their sights on a city perched on the hills above the Dnieper River, Kiev. It was a strategic jewel, a gateway to the southern empires of Byzantium and the riches of the Silk Road. While Rurik solidified his grip on the north, his influence began to seep toward the heart of the Slavic lands. This southward push was not a diplomatic mission, it was a conquest. The transition from scattered settlements to a unified principality was not a gentle process. It was forged in the heat of ambition and the cold reality of power politics. Every stone laid in the foundations of these new cities was slicked with the sweat of a people learning to be subjects of a grander vision. As the years passed, the legend of Rurik grew, yet the man himself remained an enigma, obscured by the fog of the 9th century. When his brothers passed away, Rurik did not hesitate. He consolidated their lands under his sole command, moving his capital to the great Novgorod. He was no longer just a chieftain or a hired guard, he was the architect of a dynasty that would rule for 7 centuries. He understood that order requires a central point of gravity, and he made himself that point. He created a world where the law applied to everyone, regardless of their tribe, for the first time in their history. For the people of 862, the truth was measured in the sudden absence of fire in their villages and the presence of a law that, while demanding, offered a shield against the abyss of the great discord. They had invited the wolf into the house, and the wolf had driven away the jackals. The price of this order was the loss of total autonomy, a trade-off that has defined the rise of civilizations throughout time. To live in the Rus lands was to live between the hammer and the anvil. To the east lay the powerful Khazar Khaganate, demanding tribute and influence. To the south, the Byzantine Empire, a beacon of unimaginable wealth and religious fervor. Rurik's successors had to navigate this labyrinth of empires, using both the sword and the marriage contract to secure their place. The dark thriller of the birth of the Rus is not just a story of a single man, but of a people who chose a difficult, narrow path to escape their own self-destruction. They invited the stranger to guard the gate, and in doing so, they became the cornerstone of an empire that would one day span continents. Think of the silence that must have fallen over the tribal councils once the Varangian ships appeared on the horizon. The realization that their world had changed forever must have been a heavy burden to carry. The wilderness was being tamed, not by the plow alone, but by the administrative iron of the Rurikids. They built chains of forts that allowed information and armies to move with unprecedented speed. This was the dawn of a new era, one where the individual tribe mattered less than the collective strength of the state. The Norse names of the rulers began to soften into Slavic forms. Rorikr became Rurik, Helgi became Oleg, Ingvar became Igor. Their gods began to blend with the spirits of the forest and the river, until the line between the ruler and the ruled began to blur into a new, unified identity. Every empire built on such a foundation carries the seeds of its own internal tension. The Rurikid princes would eventually turn on each other in the centuries to come, mirroring the very chaos their ancestor was brought in to solve. The cycle of history is a relentless wheel, turning from order to chaos and back again. But for those first few decades under Rurik, the sense of purpose was singular. The goal was survival, expansion, and the creation of an identity that could withstand the pressures of the surrounding world. The invitation of 862 remains one of the most debated episodes in history, sparking intense discussions about national origin and the influence of outsiders. Was it a moment of profound wisdom or a moment of total surrender? The answer likely lies in the reality of the alternative, a slow, agonizing descent into tribal oblivion. Some see it as a moment of profound humility and wisdom by the Slavic tribes, a realization that they needed a catalyst from the outside to reach their potential. Others see it as a myth designed to mask a more traditional conquest, a narrative written by the victors to make their rule seem invited rather than imposed. In the dark thriller of history, the facts are often obscured by the fog of time, leaving us only with the results. And the results were undeniable. the creation of a realm that would eventually bridge the gap between the East and the West, between the pagan past and the Christian future. The calling of the princes was a moment where the fear of the neighbor was replaced by the awe of the master, and the wild forest was forced into the shape of a throne. As Rurik's life drew to a close, he left behind a legacy that was as vast and unforgiving as the forests he ruled. He passed his authority to his kinsman, Oleg, charging him with the protection of his young son, Igor. Oleg would become the one to finally bridge the gap between the north and the south, capturing Kiev and declaring it the mother of all Russian cities. The vision that began with a desperate invitation in a time of chaos had evolved into a continental force. The Rurik dynasty would go on to produce names that still resonate with power: Vladimir the Great, Yaroslav the Wise, and eventually, the crushing weight of those who would build upon Rurik's foundation of absolute control. The iron that Rurik brought across the sea had been forged into a crown that would not be easily broken. The air in the year 862 was thick with the scent of pine and the cold promise of the sea. The men who stood on the banks of the Fokov River waiting for the ships to arrive could not have known they were witnessing the start of a story that would change the map of the world. They were trading their chaotic freedom for a structured survival. It was a moment of supreme tension, a crossroad where the path to the future was paved with the iron of the north. The invitation to Rurik is a narrative of human fragility and the desperate search for stability. It highlights the recurring theme that when systems fail, the vacuum is always filled, often by those who wait in the shadows for the right moment to strike. The legacy of that invitation is written in the stones of ancient cathedrals and the bloodlines of European royalty. It is a story that refuses to be forgotten, serving as a dark reminder of what happens when the fabric of society tears. The shadows of 862 still linger in the misty mornings of the northern plains, where the wind seems to carry the sound of distant oars and the clatter of armor. The man named Rurik may have disappeared into the annals of legend, his physical form long since returned to the earth, but the state he helped create became an immovable force. His name became a title, and his blood became a requirement for power. The tribes found their order, but they found it at the end of a Varangian blade. The end of the story is never truly the end, it is merely the foundation for the next chapter of struggle. The birth of the Kievan Rus was not the conclusion of the tribe's journey, but the beginning of a long and often violent climb toward greatness. As the sun set on the first generation of Rurik rule, the land was no longer a collection of warring villages. It was a realm, a principality, a burgeoning empire. The invitation had been accepted, the price had been paid in blood and autonomy, and the course of history had been forever altered by the arrival of the strangers from across the sea. They came as mercenaries, they stayed as masters, and they left as the fathers of a nation. In the final analysis, the calling of Rurik is a testament to the power of a single, world-altering decision made in the depths of despair. The tribes of the north reached out into the dark, and something formidable reached back. The result was a civilization forged in the crucible of necessity, a reminder that order often comes at a price that few are willing to pay until they have no other choice. The soil of the north still holds its secrets, but the weight of the iron that Rurik brought is felt to this day, a silent anchor in the turbulent, unpredictable sea of history. The great discord was silenced by the sword, and in that silence, a new world was born. The shadows have never truly left, they simply learned to wear the robes of kings.